Oficialmente les doy la bienvenida a una nueva charla ICCAS del mediodía. En esta oportunidad vamos a contar con la presentación de la doctora Wendelyn Jones, que es directora ejecutiva de IAFNS. IAFNS, si bien ya lo saben, es el Instituto para el Avance de la Ciencia de los Alimentos y la Nutrición. Pero antes de darle la palabra a Wendelyn, voy a contar brevemente lo que es ICCAS, si bien ya sé que todos ustedes lo conocen, no me va a llevar más de 2 minutos. ICCAS es un ámbito de conexión cuya misión es vincular, facilitar el intercambio entre expertos y comunicar temas de base científica y tecnológica, siempre priorizando la integridad y la calidad. Busca ofrecer un espacio de interacción transdisciplinario donde se trabaje en temas de ciencia de punta, problemáticas emergentes, comunicación responsable, capacitación y actualización profesional y trabajo colaborativo. Como Wendelyn nos va a estar presentando una de las últimas publicaciones que realizaron en el área de integridad científica, que es el marco para financiar investigación en ciencia de los alimentos y nutrición, yo les voy a contar primero brevemente sobre nuestro grupo de integridad científica, que se reúne desde el año 2017 y convoca profesionales de diferentes áreas del conocimiento, tanto del sector público como privado, para discutir y desarrollar propuestas para contribuir a la comprensión y difusión de estos temas. En primer lugar, de la credibilidad de los estudios científicos y los conflictos de interés reales o percibidos, en particular en colaboraciones público-privadas, que constituye una barrera que se interpone entre estos esfuerzos y la llegada de los beneficios a la sociedad. En segundo lugar, la calidad de la investigación, de las publicaciones y de las actividades científicas propiamente dichas. Y en tercer lugar, pero no menos importante, la comunicación responsable de hallazgos y evidencia científica y su análisis crítico. Siguiendo con el tema de la comunicación responsable, como saben, hace solo 15 días tuvimos la 4ª edición de nuestro foro de comunicación responsable en ciencia y salud. Estos encuentros se realizan desde el año 2019 y tienen un enfoque multidisciplinario donde se comparten experiencias profesionales y personales a la hora de comunicar de manera responsable frente a los desafíos del exceso de la información y la desinformación. Los videos de las 4 ediciones del foro están disponibles en la web de Infoalimentos, que es infoalimentos.org.ar. Ahora sí, vamos a lo que nos compete en el día de hoy. Voy a presentar rápidamente a la doctora Wendelyn Jones, que recibió su doctorado de la Universidad Vanderbilt y completó su fellowship postdoctoral en MIT. Cuenta con más de 20 años de experiencia en el sector público y privado en temas de alimentos, agricultura y químicos. Comenzó su carrera en la Administración de Alimentos y Medicamentos de Estados Unidos y en el Servicio de Inspección Sanitaria de Plantas y Animales del Departamento de Agricultura de ese país. Además, trabajó en el sector privado, en empresas como Syngenta y DuPont, y actualmente, como dije cuando comencé, es la directora ejecutiva de IAFNS. Últimos 2 slides y los dejo con Wendelyn. Al final de la charla vamos a tener un breve espacio de preguntas, así que pueden ir dejando si quieren sus consultas en el chat. Y por último, este video va a estar subtitulado en nuestro canal de YouTube, ICCAS Ciencia. Entiendo que están todos suscriptos, pero si no se suscribieron todavía, los invito a hacerlo. And now, Wendelyn, we are very, very excited to listen to you. So, whenever you're ready, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mariana, and buenas tardes, everyone. My name is Wendelyn Jones, and I am the Executive Director at the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, which we affectionately abbreviate as IAFNS. And today I'm happy to share with all of you some best practices for funding of food and nutrition research. I want to first start out with my disclosure / conflict of interest slide. And here you will note that I am employed by IAFNS, and as was shared in my brief biography, I am a former employee of Corteva Agrisciences. If we go back further in time, I worked for others in industry, as well as starting my career in government following graduate school. Of note, and because I know ICCAS has a strong emphasis on scientific integrity, I hope you all realize that I'm starting with this disclosure / conflict of interest form for a reason, and it gets into making sure that as funders of science, we are modeling the behavior we expect from others. So first, let me introduce IAFNS, or the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences. IAFNS mobilizes our membership from government, industry, and academia to drive, fund, and lead actionable science. We are focused, as our name implies, on food safety and nutritional sciences, all to advance public health. We do our work by catalyzing the creation of scientific knowledge. That comes in two possible forms. One, funding of research that's conducted by others outside of IAFNS, as well as convening of experts. We do this to support positive change in the food and beverage ecosystem. Our collaborative and inclusive structure empowers members to bring forward their diverse perspectives. All of this is about advancing science that matters. I want to take a moment, and very similar to what we just heard in the introduction, and emphasize that at IAFNS, we live our core values. Our core values include scientific integrity, transparency, collaboration, and public benefit. By design, our multi-sector structure, bringing together the private sector of industry with public sector representatives from government and academia, is designed to prevent any single interest from dominating. Further, we are committed to publishing our results regardless of outcome. Moving on to transparency, we're committed to the full disclosure of our funding, research, and scientific methods, and the data that we generate will help support scientific advancements. Collaboration, we believe that engaging government, industry, and academic scientists makes research stronger and minimizes biases. All of our work, whether it's projects that we fund externally, whether it is experts that we convene in a webinar, must address issues of broad public health interest with an aim of improving and benefiting the public. Now, I'm sitting here and I'm going through who we are as an organization, as well as our core values. And some of you may know us under prior components, but I did want to, while we're on this core value slide, emphasize that IAFNS is a new organization. We evolved from another organization, and in that evolution, with a new name and a new brand that better reflects who we are and where we are going, the first thing that our board of trustees did was to define our core values. And I think that that is just so important to keep in mind when we talk about making sure that science and evidence-based decision-making is accessible by all. You have to start first by knowing your core values. And I know similar to ICCAS, where with IAFNS, we have a strong adherence to our core values. So let's talk a little bit more about who IAFNS is. And here I'm showing you, quote, our recipe. So our recipe, which comes into what are the parts that come together to allow IAFNS to connect, collaborate, and catalyze science with impact. First and foremost, it is that peer-reviewed publication space. We also know that that peer-reviewed publication is not the final step, but it is just one part of how we work to disseminate that knowledge. So we have our peer-reviewed publications. We take those peer-reviewed publications and in a responsible manner, we'll share and connect with media outlets, whether it's social media or more traditional media, to really start getting some earned media mentions, where what we're counting here is not the number of times that IAFNS is mentioned, but really what we're looking at is how many times that the work and the conclusions are accurately represented in the trade press. The next element or ingredient in our recipe is around the convening of experts. We often do this through webinars, and as we are slowly perhaps coming out of COVID, I'll also highlight that we are slowly returning to in-person meetings. The last ingredient in IAFNS recipe is reflected with our collaboration with other groups. Collaboration is one of our core values, but it is also very relevant to ensuring that the science that needs to be done, the connections that need to be made, the collaborations that need to be forged, all of that can be delivered with impact. So with this kind of as a recipe, with my having talked a bit about how we purposefully fund research as well as convene experts, what I want to transition to now is how do we go about ensuring scientific integrity? And what we know is that in the conduct of research, which can involve public-private research relationships, the IAFNS Assembly on Scientific Integrity has issued, and it was initially released on the web in June of 2022 and went to final proofs available on the internet last month in August of 2022, guiding principles for funding industry funding of food and nutrition research. With this, there's a lot on this slide, right? And we will spend some of our time here today going through each one of these principles and discussing why it matters. But before I go there, we're talking about industry funding of science. I thought it'd be good to kind of start with why is industry involved in funding science? And perhaps the question might be, what would happen if industry wasn't involved in funding science? So this slide is taken from an older publication from the Journal of the American Medical Association. And what you will see in this slide is funding by various sources. Of note, what I want to highlight is the blues and grays up at the top refer to funding, and this is US, okay? Refer to funding that's coming in from state, local, as well as federal funding for medical research. And it is actually the greens below it that show how much money is spent on research by industry. So the greens reflect medical device investments, biotech firms, and pharmaceutical firms. And as you look at this slide, what you'll notice, whether we're talking about where the graph starts on the left-hand side in 1994, or where the graph ends on the right-hand side in 2012. If you got rid of all of those greens, right, you got rid of that lower half, there would be significantly less money being spent on science and innovation. Now, this slide is an interesting example of broadly across different areas in the medical arena, which would actually include funding on the food side. But let's talk about, again, this is a US example, but let's talk about funding overall in the US on research and development. And this slide is a bit more current, and what you'll see starting on this is the scale on the x-axis starts in year 2000 and ends on the right in 2018. Where what you'll notice is the federal line, which is at the top in the blue, the federal funding for US research and development by percent is decreasing. What's going on there? How is science still advancing? Is that you look at the funding by corporate entities or by industry, which is shown in red. And what you see is that there is an increase in the amount of money that is being contributed by percentage by industry. So what I'm hoping the key takeaway from both of these slides is that when you think about advancing science, right, and you think about ensuring that governments can make decisions based on evidence, that consumers can make decisions based on evidence, that we as society writ large must embrace the fact that industry and private sector funding of science is core. It can't all be done always at that federal or governmental level. So given that you can't just fund the science coming from, in this case, the US federal government or the US state governments, it is industry that's coming along. What then are some of the options to best handle what happens when industry funds the science? So want to highlight that, the food industry plays a critical role in advancing food safety and nutrition sciences. And IAFNS's updated guiding principles provide a modernized framework for minimizing bias and promoting the integrity of industry-funded research. This publication that came out earlier this year in 2022 is an update of an article, a peer-reviewed article that was originally published in 2008. And within this current update, we're providing some clarifications. We're strengthening the guardrails that separate the funding from the science. We're reflecting the shift in the scientific community towards open science, and we are advocating for greater transparency on the interaction between the funder and the investigator. Now, before I click and start going through some of these guiding principles one by one, I also want to highlight that funding often, the way it often can work is that funding can be provided by industry. And we're talking here about industry going and funding researchers who are not, quote, their employees. So we're talking about industry going and funding researchers at a university, right? But I would posit that what should be happening is that these principles apply as well to when industry is funding some internal research, right? As well as, candidly, when government funds its own research, that these principles need to also apply. So let's get going. The first principle, and I think that this is really very foundational, okay, in that you want to be ensuring that the research is being done in a factual, transparent, and objectively designed manner, where the research is designed to investigate or test an appropriate hypothesis, rather than having it designed to favor a particular outcome. So you're really looking at making sure that the science that's being done is being done to advance the knowledge. So how can this come about? How can this be reflected? This could be even as simple as ensuring that you always have appropriate controls designed, okay? Because we all can think of various case studies where we know whether it was control animals weren't appropriately used or other controls weren't appropriately selected. So the first principle is around making sure that the design of the study is appropriate. I'll next move to the second principle, which is that the study design, the research itself, and the interpretation of the findings need to remain with the scientific investigator, i.e., it is up to that scientist who's working in the lab to read the results that are coming off of that slide or coming out of that assay. It needs to be in the control of the investigator. Moving to the third principle, and I think that this one's one I'm going to spend a little bit of time on, is that if you're going to be acting with scientific integrity, and I know we all want to be, you cannot be offering or accepting remuneration money geared towards the outcome of a research project, okay? So you cannot incentivize scientists to ensure that the results come out on one side versus the results coming out on a different side. Now, part of me, candidly, you know, when I first saw this initial proposal come through, I actually, you know, had discussions with the team going, wait a second, that's implying that scientists are fraudulent. Okay, that's what this is about, you know, that a scientist is going to purposefully not report their full data set, right? They're not going to follow the appropriate scientific method. But following discussions with the IAFNS team, as well as with experts from government and experts from academia, I came to realize that while this is perhaps on one level a bit insulting to say that you can't be incentivized, it is still so fundamental to ensuring scientific integrity that we did need to state that there cannot be any remuneration geared towards the outcome of a research project. Okay, so this is where we're talking about research that's being done. I'll move to the fourth principle. And this is actually, I touched on this in the overview that I gave on IAFNS, in that there is an obligation, and it needs to be written down, that the researchers have an obligation to attempt to publish the findings and the freedom to choose the journal in which they submit. So there's two parts here, right? And let's tease them apart. The first is obligation to attempt to publish. So we all know that the scientific peer-reviewed process, and I think everybody has been through it, where you sit there and you submit, and you know what, this is clearly, it should go into this journal, and then for whatever reason, it may or may not be accepted in that journal, right? Etc. So we can't say that it absolutely must be published, okay, because you can't guarantee that an editor would accept it. But there needs to be a written obligation that the researchers have a quote required to submit it somewhere for publication. Okay, so they have to attempt to publish the work. And then it comes into the second part here, is around the freedom to choose the journal. So as scientists, we all know that there are high-ranking journals in our field and there are lower-ranking journals in our field. It is not appropriate, if we're going to be acting with scientific integrity, to tell the researcher that, guess what, I can't pay you to get the results that I want. I can't control how you're going to do these studies, right? But I'm going to make sure that it goes into a lower tier journal. Nope, that can't be done. It needs to be up to the researcher what journal they are going to attempt to publish it within. Okay. I'll move on to the next principle here, and this is principle number 5, which requires that in publications as well as in presentations, that there is a written or oral disclosure of relationships, of relevant relationships. You know, I started my talk with all of you today with my disclosure conflict of interest form. And it stated financial as well as non-financial competing interests. Historically, that kind of look back in time as what time, and it's highly variable, right? You know, I mentioned, for example, one of my former employers in writing on the disclosure form because I was employed by them less than 5 years ago. Could also be looking forward, right? To say, hey, I know that I'm going to be getting this grant or that grant. Okay. So we know that we have to have that type of components going in there, and you need to be reporting things that people need to know, things that, gee, is this related? Is this not related? You know what, if you have questions, go ahead and share it, because you will never be criticized for oversharing on this one, okay? Moving to principle number 6, not participate in undisclosed authorship agreements, okay, in publications or presentations. So what this refers to is if you're writing a scientific article and a junior scientist is part of that research team, that junior scientist needs to be acknowledged, right? It also means that if you're working with someone and you're working with someone who's more senior, who perhaps has their own consulting business, right? You need to make sure that you are disclosing and sharing who wrote the actual papers. Moving on to principle 7. And this is where, in the effort of transparency, this is about guaranteeing access to the data. Okay, so principle 7 states guarantee accessibility of all data and controls of statistical analysis, right, by investigators and appropriate peer reviewers, and encourage the practice of open science. This is where, and for IAFNS, we work with the Center for Open Science at the University of Virginia in the United States. There are other platforms and mechanisms in place, but that's who we work with the idea of saying, hey, we're going to upload and make publicly available, right, in a documented manner. Here's the hypothesis we're testing. We'll upload the relevant data. More and more journals are allowing the sharing and supplemental materials of supporting background data, and we want to be encouraging that very publicly. I will also note, while this is something that funders should do, whether the funder is a nonprofit organization like IAFNS, it's also something that should be done by others, including the government. So government spends money on research, right? They should also be opening up and sharing their science too. Moving on to principle 8, what we have here is talking about clear statements of affiliation. So stated another way, and I touched on this a few slides ago, oftentimes there will be senior researchers who have an appointment in one university, but they perhaps have a side consulting business. If we're going to be transparent, and if we're going to act with full and embrace fully principles of scientific integrity, that means that academic researchers need to make clear statements on their affiliation. So that's saying that if a senior level researcher has a consulting group and that's where that funding is coming through, it needs to state that it's going to that consulting group and not that academic group. Finally, and this is the last guiding principle, and this is a new one compared to the older versions of our guiding principles on scientific integrity from IAFNS, is that we want to require, whether it's in publication or in conference presentations, a disclosure on whether the funder advised on the study design, conduct of research, or the development of the manuscript. Now, this is a trend that is growing in some segments of science. Okay, so in some lines, you are seeing more and more journals come out with a mandatory requirement that there's a statement around, the roles and responsibilities of the first author versus the second author, etc., to be clear about what they contributed to that peer-reviewed article.